Hey, how are you? How are you? I hope you're well. I hope you're wonderful. And thank you so much for stopping by my little, my little corner of the basement. I'm getting over the flu, so if I sound a little froggy, that's why. So tonight, I wanted to do a video that was inspired by the Disney movie Wish, and I don't want to give anything away if you haven't seen it, but it's like their anniversary film for their 100 years. It has a lot of cute Easter eggs in it from lots of different Disney films, but there's these wish bubbles in it. Like, people have wishes and they're in these little bubbles. So I thought it would be nice if we released your wish bubbles into the universe and we pop them to set the wishes free and, do some manifestation and put them out there. Try and make them a reality, So we're going to do some wish bubble popping and manifestation. I have my manifestation candle. It says, "My dreams are now my reality." And this is one of those candles that has crystals and herbs in it, all to help bring those wishes into a reality. So I'm gonna light this. I have some matches. I can't find my lighter. I'm scared of matches. So I'm going to light this off camera and then I'll show you. Okay. Okay. So start thinking about all those wishes and all those dreams deep in your mind. You don't have to say them out loud. I know some wishes can be very personal, so you can just think them to yourself. Just those things you're striving for, those desires. Put them to the forefront. And we're going to release those bubbles out of your mind and into the air. Okay. Let's put this here so you can see it. I think, yeah, you can see that there. Perfect. And we're going to let those bubbles float, 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 and flutter, 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 flutter. All those bubbles are floating around. All those bubbles floating around. We're going to take our little butterfly pin and we're going to release them into the universe, okay? Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. And they'll flutter away, they'll flutter away, they'll flutter away. Float, 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 float. And flutter away, flutter away, flutter away, flutter away. Float, 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 float. Float, float, float. Look at those bubbles. Bubbles, 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 bubbles. And flutter away, flutter away, flutter away. Float, 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 float. Flutter away, flutter away. Bubbles float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Flutter away, flutter away, flutter away. Go ahead, release all those wishes, all those bubbles. And let them float around, float around, float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Bubbles, 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 bubbles. Bubbles, 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 bubbles. And the wishes will flutter away, flutter away, flutter away into the universe. Bubbles, 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 bubbles. Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Float, 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 float. Float free. Let them float free, free, free. Float, 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 float. Float, float. Flutter away, flutter away, flutter away, flutter away, flutter away. All those desires and all those dreams. Put it out there. Put it out into she come back to you in positivity and light, positivity and light. No more dreams, just reality. I make my dreams a reality. I make my dreams a reality, a reality, 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 reality. I make my dreams reality, 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 reality. Flutter away, flutter away, flutter away, flutter away. This is my truth. This is my truth. Float, 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 My dreams do come true. My dreams do come true. Float, 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 float. 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 And flutter away, flutter away, flutter away. Okay. You're doing so well. Just relax. Just relax. Take in the scent. Say it out loud or say it to yourself. My dreams are my reality. My dreams are my reality. Universe, take my wishes. And keep them safe until they're ready for me. Take my wishes and keep them safe until they're ready. There we go. All right. Thank you again for stopping by. I always love hanging out with you. And thank you for trusting me with your wishes. All right, I'll let you get your rest. You have a good night.